Welcome, everyone, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I work with public programs at the museum. And this afternoon, you have a very special opportunity to listen to Eddy Boas, a Holocaust survivor who will share his story with you. And afterwards, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A box. And this is a very special opportunity because Eddy is joining us from his home in Sydney, Australia today. Before we begin, I just want to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. And they did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust. And as a result, many survivors were not yet willing to speak. Thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. The museum is currently closed for construction, but during our closure, we are offering a variety of online programs, including weekly Holocaust survivor testimonies on Sundays at 3 o'clock Pacific time. And survivor talks are generously supported by Dr. Arnold L. Gilberg and family. And of course, one of the benefits of doing these virtual programs is that we can have survivors like Eddy join all the way from Australia. And it is truly my honor and privilege to welcome and introduce him today. And I want to thank you, Eddy, so much for being with us today and for sharing your story with Holocaust Museum LA and our community. Thank you so much, and you may begin. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everybody from Sydney, Australia, and good afternoon to you in Los Angeles and wherever else it's afternoon. As Michael said, my name is Eddy Boas. I was born in The Hague, the Netherlands, on the 26th of January 1940. 1940 was an interesting year. It's when the war broke out in Holland. My parents and my parents' families had lived in Holland for 200 years or more. But the Dutch and the Germans didn't care about that. The Germans invaded Holland on the 10th of May 1940, 3 months and 15 days after I was born. And the odds of me surviving turned out to be 6 million to 1. So sitting here in Sydney, Australia, and talking to you in Los Angeles and wherever else it may be is quite a miracle. As I said before, my parents' families had lived in Holland. Both my mother and my father's family had lived in Holland for over 200 years. They've mixed in with the Dutch community. My mother's family was religious. My father's family was not. My grandparents on my mother's side followed the Jewish religion, but they passed away in the 1930s before the war broke out in Holland. My mother's father had a fruit shop in The Hague. My mother left school at 15, and she was the first woman in the Netherlands to drive a truck because she did the deliveries to the fruit shops around Amsterdam and The Hague. My mother also was the second lady, apparently, who drove a motorbike. So the police got to know her pretty well. My mother was a nice-looking lady, and she was very friendly with the police, which came in handy later on. My father owned a fruit shop in Amsterdam, and he went to The Hague to buy fruit at my mother's father's place. That's where they met. They met around 1932. They started to love each other and got married in 1934. My father was an active sportsman. He was a bike racer. He also served in the Dutch army. He was in the cavalry. That also, horses became a big part of my life. My father's family, he had a sister and a brother. This was my father going to Dutch East Indies in 1933. He had already, before he met my mother, had organized to go to the Dutch East Indies, where we had relatives. Dutch East Indies, of course, today is Indonesia. My father took this boat to Indonesia, but didn't last very long. He missed my mother, came back about 6 months later. That is my mother's family at the top. My mother had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. My father had, that's what the wedding photo of my mother and father with my mother's sister's children. I'll just go back to this. My mother's sisters, 3 sisters, and my mother's 2 brothers all perished in the Holocaust. My father's sister and my father's brother, the same thing. That's the wedding photo, as I said before. This is my father in the army. He served in the army, fought the Germans at a place called the Grebbeberg, which is halfway between Amsterdam and the German border. But all to no avail. The Germans defeated the Dutch 5 days after starting the war and occupied Holland and took over government. And the government ran as if nothing had happened. The government departments all reported to a German called Seyss-Inquart. This is my father in the army. He's the big man over there. And that's just before the war. My brother, he was born in 1935, so he was 4 or 5 years older than me. That's where we lived in The Hague, on the 2nd floor, up there. And when the Germans took over, all the Jews, anti-Jewish regulations came in. Jews had to wear a Star of David, which says in Dutch Jew, Jood. The sign says, forbidden for Jews. That's a photo of my father during the war where he worked for the Jewish Council. There is the one in the yellow, you had to hand in all your radios to the Germans. So that's my parents handing in the radio, got a receipt for it, which didn't mean very much. And at the top there's a registration for us living in The Hague. When the war broke out, the Dutch Census Department, and they had done a census in Holland in 1939, handed over the census list where all the Jews lived to the Germans. So as soon as Germans took over the government departments, they knew exactly where all the Jews in Holland lived. At that time, there were 120,000 Jews, Dutch Jews living in Holland, and 20,000 refugees from Germany and Poland. So it was a total of 140,000 Jews in Holland. Life became pretty tough for Jews. Jews weren't allowed to go into parks, as the sign says there, forbidden for Jews. Jews weren't allowed to go, Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to school. Initially, it was just they could go to school, only being taught by Jewish teachers, but that didn't last very long. Jews were not allowed to go to non-Jewish doctors or medical practitioners. Jews were not allowed on trams in the city. And a year later, 1941, Jews were not allowed to leave their home except on certain days and certain hours that's designated by the Nazis. The Dutch police became anti-Jewish. It was led by an anti-Semite. The police arrested Jews The police paid money to Dutch neighbors to betray their Jews. And one day when my mother went shopping at a certain time that was designated, she always took me in the pram and my brother by the hand, and she bumped into a policeman and she said, "Hello, Derek, how are you?" And they had a bit of a chat. And my mother went he asked her, "Where are you going?" And my mother went to a shop to buy some warm clothing for my brother and myself. Dutch Jews were not supposed to have any money. All their belongings were supposed to be deposited into a special bank. My parents weren't rich. They were working people. But my mother bought myself a hat, a beanie and a cap, and the same for my brother. And as she walked out, Derek was standing there, and Derek came up to her and said, "Don't talk, Susie. Grab a boy's hand and push Eddie and keep your head down." And they walked away towards where we lived, and we came across a roadblock, which manned by Dutch Nazis, and called out to Derek, "Good catch there, Derek, young woman with 2 children." And he mumbled to my mother, "Don't lift your head, don't talk, just keep walking." He walked us back to our flat, and he stayed outside our flat all night, watching over us. So, like, as I said before, the Dutch police were bad, but everywhere there's good people and bad people, and Derek certainly saved our lives. Otherwise, we would have been put into a truck and sent to one of the concentration camps. Our time came on the 28th of September 1943. My parents had kept on working before the war, and as I said before, they were stuck at home. My father had returned from the war front in May 1940. He had stolen a Jeep, and he and 2 other soldiers drove it to The Hague. My father hardly left our flat. He was a very big man and very active person, and sometimes he did take a chance at night to go for a walk, get some fresh air, but mainly stayed at home. My mother was the one who went to the shops when she was allowed to go. In the middle of the night of the 28th of September, our front door was bashed in by a Dutch Nazi and a German soldier. They ran up the 2 flights of stairs calling "Heraus, heraus," which means "get out, get out." I, of course, woke up crying. I was 3 years old. My brother, who was 5 by then, also crying. And my mother and my father came out, and my mother said to the Dutch Nazi, "You're a filthy beast," and he hit her with the rifle butt. And my mother then threw a tin of talcum powder at her, and he said to her, "You've made the place dirty." And she said, "You're the only filthy piece here." And he hit her with the rifle butt again. Then they pushed us down the stairs. My mother take me in her arms, and my father had the little bags that we were allowed to take, one for each of us, pushed us to a truck, and where we were loaded into, the truck was surrounded by Dutch police and our neighbors, who by then had stopped talking to us, despite the fact that before the war, before the Nazis came, my mother was very friendly with the neighbors. The neighbors used to babysit my brother and me before May, and my mother used to babysit their children. But when the Nazis started to take control of Holland, the Dutch population turned on the Jews. Now, on the 28th of September, when they put us in the truck, they took us to the railway station, where they put us on a train to a transit camp called camp Westerbork, which was in northern Holland in the province Drenthe, and was established in 1939 as a refugee camp for Germans and the Polish Jews. The capacity was supposed to be 8,000 and had 24 barracks. As time went on, more and more barracks were built, and the barracks where we stayed, Barrack 70, held 800 prisoners. The four of us were together. The first train that left for Westerbork was on 15th of July 1942, and the first train that went to Auschwitz was in July 1942. In 1943, the Germans took complete control of Westerbork, and a barrack was supposed to hold about 300, but ours held 800 prisoners. We were there for 4 months. My father was given a horse and cart to go to the farms around Westerbork camp to get food from them for the prisoners, the Jews in Westerbork. And that was his job. My mother's job was sewing uniforms and things like that. On the 1st of February 1944, we were put on a train to Bergen-Belsen. What the Germans did, they made up a list on Monday and hung that on a board and advised everyone when they were supposed to be deported. So you had to go look on the board to see if your name was on the list. And one day my father found our name on the list, which says Bergen-Belsen, the train to Bergen-Belsen. When he told my mother complained. She said, I don't want to go to Bergen-Belsen, I want to go to Auschwitz. She had heard rumors that her family was in Auschwitz, her mother's sisters were in Auschwitz, and told my father to go and see the Germans to change the train for us to go to Auschwitz. Fortunately for us, it was the first time that the Germans made a decision that was very smart, because if we had been sent to Auschwitz, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, most likely. Bergen-Belsen wasn't a holiday camp either. It was mainly built to hold prisoners of war, and in 1940, the first Russian soldiers arrived. It became an exchange camp for Jews to be exchanged in 1943, in a special camp called Star Camp. There were 6,000 Jews, and we were in Star Camp. Then there were special camps for Poles, neutral camp, Hungarian camp, men's camp, women's camp. And in total, the tent camp initially, and Frank and his sister Margaret arrived there with Anne Frank, then was transferred to Star Camp. This is the layout of Bergen-Belsen. It's held supposedly only to hold 10,000 people, but at one stage towards the end of the war, it held 50, 60,000 people. And 50, 60,000 Jews were murdered in Bergen-Belsen through starvation and typhus. The camp, my father was in Barrack 11. We were, my brother, my mother, and I were in Barrack 22. My father's job in the camp was picking up the dead bodies off the ground and out of the barracks in a horse and cart. He was given 2 horses to be in charge of and a cart to go around the camp to pick up the dead bodies. The dead bodies per day became more and more as time went on. This is Bergen-Belsen, that's the main road down the middle. On the right is the Star Camp, on the left is the general camp. That's the layout of Westerbork. We were in the top barrack there, which held 800 people. It's a photo of Westerbork. Didn't look much good either. That's where we slept in, 3 bunks. My My brother was supposed to sleep at the top. I was supposed to sleep in the middle, and my mother at the bottom. As it turns out, I slept with my mother most of the time, and my brother slept in the middle. From Westerbork, the first train left there in July with 1,100 Jews on it. Only 854 survived, from a total of 58,000 Jews sent to Auschwitz. Of the 34,000 Jews sent to Sobibor, only 18 survived. Of the 3,751 Jews sent to Bergen-Belsen, including my mother, my father, and myself, 2,050 survived, and 4,894 Jews were sent to Theresienstadt in what then called Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic. 1,980 survived. Now, per head of population, more Dutch Jews were murdered than from any other Western country, European country. Out of the 107,000 Dutch Jews sent to concentration camp, 102,000 were murdered. Only 5,000 survived and returned to Holland after the war. Of my immediate family, my father's family, 37 were murdered. The only survivors was my father and a cousin. On my mother's side, 26 immediate members of my mother's sisters, brothers, cousins were murdered, and only my mother survived. According to the Red Cross and Yad Vashem, they have no other record of a family of four, in our case, father, mother, 2 children, 2 sons, going into a concentration camp and surviving and coming out of that concentration camp. They don't say it didn't happen, but they have no records of it. And they said, Yad Vashem said it was a unique situation. This is Bergen-Belsen. Doesn't look very tidy. Dead bodies lying around. That kept my father very busy. The numbers dying in Bergen-Belsen was pretty high. You can see there, in the end, 50 to 60,000 people died. My father's job of collecting the bodies and feeding the horses, again, gave us an opportunity to be saved. My father was able to steal food that was meant for the horses. Horses were fed better than Jews, I'm sorry. Horses were fed better than the Jewish population of Bergen-Belsen. Horses were given apples, carrots, potatoes, and whatever else they eat. Prisoners were given a bit of parsnip that was sort of put in water, and hot water with tasted like pasta. Sometimes there was a piece of bread in it, sometimes a little bit of potato. But because my father was able to steal an apple or a carrot, and he got it to my mother through my brother. My brother was following my father around the camp when he went around the camp to pick up the bodies. And once in a while, when he stopped, he would drop an apple or a carrot, and my brother would crawl and pick it up and run to my mother. My mother used to use that as like a currency, as trading with other prisoners. Like I was a growing boy. I was 4 when I got into Bergen-Belsen, 3 in Westerbork, and 2, my birthday was just before I arrived in Bergen-Belsen on the 1st of February 1944. I was 4 years old. My brother was 8 by now, and we were growing boys, but there's no shops there, and the only way to get clothing is to get it from children of around about the same age as us who had been murdered. And my mother would swap a jumper or shoes or whatever with the mother of a child that had died, and got a jumper or a shoe or shoes or whatever. My brother used to go around the camp stealing the clothing of dead children. It sounds horrible, but it's the only way that we, my brother and I, were able to stay sort of warm. And it was a terrible winter in 1944-45. My shoes were hard to get, and my mother told me to pee on my feet to keep my feet warm. The British liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April. A survivor of both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, Olga Horrocks, who only passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 96, said, people talked about Auschwitz, of course, but there were so many other camps, and Bergen-Belsen was surely one of the worst. They did not need to have gas chambers there. Thousands, as I said before, died in Bergen-Belsen, including Anne Frank and her sister Margot. They were initially in Auschwitz, but then when the Allies started to conquer Eastern Europe, the Nazis tried to empty Auschwitz and put women and children on trains, especially on trains, and men marching out of Auschwitz towards the west. And Frank arrived by train at Bergen-Belsen in October 1944, her and her sister. My father, when he had to meet the trains to get the dead bodies out of the trains, and he always shouted, are there any Dutch on board? And one day, 2 young girls came up to him and said, yes, they are Dutch. My father asked them if they had family here, and they said they don't know. And my father went around the camp to find out if Anne Frank had family in Bergen-Belsen. The answer was no. Her mother had been murdered in Auschwitz. Her father survived. Now, I don't use the word murdered lightly. There's many people who say Jews were killed or died in Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. No Jew died or got killed. Every Jew, every one of the 6 million Jews were murdered. That was the aim of the Nazis, to murder every Jew. And my father had a terrible job, which affected him for the rest of his life, which I'll tell you about it later. 1944, April 1944, the British surrounded Bergen-Belsen. The Germans came out with a white flag and negotiated. This is the camp commander, Kramer, Joseph Kramer, and his female partner, Irma Gretze. He ran Bergen-Belsen. He was the one who stopped the food going to the prisoners from about October 1944, November, and got worse and worse. And by the time February came around, there was virtually no food at all. And people were dying in Bergen-Belsen, murdered via starvation and an infectious disease called typhus. And Frank died of typhus and was murdered of starvation. And Frank and his sister both were murdered by starvation and being infected by typhus. Typhus was a terrible disease. If you lasted 12 days of having it, you would survive. But most people didn't last 12 days. I, along the way, did get infected by typhus, and I survived, which I can prove by sitting here in front of you in Sydney, Australia, and talking to you in LA in the United States. These are not two very nice people. She had a terrible reputation. Both of them were found guilty, and both of them were executed in December 1945. She was the youngest female SS officer to be executed. She was 22 years old. And you used to go around the camp with a dog which attacked the bodies or half alive people lying on the ground. She was a terrible, terrible person. We weren't in Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April when the Germans and the British did a deal that they would not fight over Bergen-Belsen. The Germans would surrender because of typhus. Germans were dying of typhus. And when the British went in on the 15th of February, they also got infected by typhus and some of their soldiers died. And they decided to burn the place down. And they put fire to every barrack in Bergen-Belsen. And Bergen-Belsen is no longer standing. And it killed all, of course, the typhus insects that gave it typhus. We weren't there on the 15th of April. The Germans had decided that the 6,000 Jews in Star Camp should be sent to the east, to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, to be put in gas chambers. And three trains left Bergen-Belsen between the 9th and between the 8th and the 10th of April. The first train with mainly Hungarian Jews and a few Dutch on board was liberated after 1 week by the Americans. The second train with mainly Hungarians and some Dutch on board did make it to Theresienstadt, and it's unknown what happened to the passengers. We were on the third train, which left the evening, late evening, early morning, the 10th, packed with 2,400 Dutch Jews and a few Hungarian Jews. This train, cattle wagon, pulled by locomotive, or a few cattle wagons pulled by locomotive, became known as the Lost Train. This train zigzagged through Eastern Germany to Western Germany. It went north, it went west, it went east. We were on that train for 2 weeks with no food or water. The train stopped many times because the Allies were bombing the tracks around the place and were bombing Germany. And whenever the train stopped, my mother and other, mainly women, would jump off the train to go and steal food from the farms. An apple or mainly potatoes, really. And then came back and made a fire, and that's how we found food. Water just along the river banks when we came to a river. At 2 weeks on that train, we ended up in Berlin at the main railway station, where the officials had no idea what to do with that train. Eventually, they decided to send the train to Poland, go south, and the train went south. On the 2 weeks later, on the 23rd of April, the train was liberated by the Russians. The Russians killed all the German Nazis on board, but a lot of them had jumped from the train and disappeared. This is a list of people on the train. That's myself, Elias Boas, Philip Boas, my father, Samuel Boas, my brother, and Sarah Schoonhoed Boas, my mother, the four of us. That's us on the list. My official name at birth was Elias. When I was born, I had no birth certificate, which I didn't get ever. I got a citizen's certificate from the Dutch embassy when we arrived in Australia. I'll get to that later. But my mother was going to call me Elias because of her father. But because it was a Jewish name, they decided to call me Eddy, and Eddy has stuck with me all the way. It's here it's spelled Klias, so they couldn't even get my name right. This is our registration when we got back to Holland. And what happened was, so we were liberated by the Russians. Excuse me. The Russians took us to a place called Trobitz. And we walked there. The Russians kicked the Germans out of their flats in Trobitz and put the Dutch Jewish families in there. We were put in a school and slept on a mattress on the floor, the four of us. We stuck together. The Russians were very good to the Jews, and every survivor that went through Trobitz says the same thing about the Russians. They looked after the Jews. If there was a disagreement with the Germans, they always took the side of the Jews. But again, food was the problem. And the Russians allowed the Jews to go around the farms and steal whatever they wanted to steal, which there was a chicken if you wanted to, or whatever the food was. And that's how we... But I was infected with typhus, and the Russians, and so were other people, and the Russians started to die, and so did other people. On the train of 2,400, 400 had passed away on the train of typhus and starvation. And whilst in Trobitz, people started to die of typhus and starvation. In other words, they're being murdered, not so much by the Nazis nowadays, but just through the lack of food and water. But the Russians were very, very helpful, and they decided to everyone that had infection of typhus to send them down south to a place called Riza, so that the Russians and the people that didn't have typhus were safe in Trobitz. We were put on a truck and taken to Riza. We're now into late May, early June. The Dutch government, the war was finished by now, but nobody came looking for us. I don't think anybody knew. Well, I know nobody knew this train existed. So in Riza, my father decided he wanted to go back to Holland. He bribed a Russian soldier to take us in a jeep to the River Elbe, where he dropped us off about a kilometer away. We walked there. There was a bridge there. On the other side of the bridge, there was an American army platoon, and they had some gypsies who wanted to come across to the east, and we were exchanged. The four of us were exchanged for 4 gypsies, and the Americans took us to another school where we were given a mattress and made a place to sleep for ourselves. I was sick, my mother wasn't very good, and my father was hardly healthy either. My brother was the only one, and he went out into Leipzig to steal food or beg on the streets for money so we could buy some food. But stealing food and clothing was the main thing that he did. Now, one day, a British soldier came across my brother. The British soldier's name, which I found out later, was Captain Douglas. Somehow or other, my brother, who doesn't speak English at 8, 9 years old, 9 years old, and the British Army captain doesn't speak Dutch, but somehow or other, my brother managed to get the Captain Douglas to the school where we were. He immediately organized for us to be taken by ambulance to the British field officer, where they gave us medication, food, and looked after us for 10 days, 2 weeks, and made us better. The British captain and an American major organized for us to be put on a train to Holland. When we arrived in Holland, this is my registration card that I received from the Red Cross. We arrived on the border, of course, of the German and Dutch border, which was in the east of Holland. We were kept there for a few days, But my father decided to go back to The Hague, go back to our flat, and start a new life. We took a bus. The Red Cross put us on a bus to The Hague. When the bus dropped us off about a 10-minute, 15-minute walk from where we used to live, 39 Kruinhofstraat. When we arrived there, my father knocked on the door. We were standing there, and a person opened the door. My father told him, "This is our place on the second floor," and they shut the door in our face. My father went to the police, and we all went to the police. We all went to the local city council. We were told to get lost by everybody, didn't want to know us. And my mother remembered there was a monastery not far from there. We went to the monastery, who gave us accommodation, a bed to sleep. My father and my mother had found out when we had arrived in Holland from Germany, that none of their family had survived, and they were the only ones left. There we were, no money, no home, and no family. I have never known, never had a grandmother, an auntie, an uncle, or a cousin to this day. Second cousin, there was one, and one in England, and third, there were none. We were the four of us, my brother, my mother, my father, and myself. But we had no home. My father found a non-Jewish relative who owned a pub in The Hague, and she took us in. And then the council gave us a flat not far from where we lived before, with no windows in it because the place was bombed and it was bad condition, but at least we had a roof over our head. That's what the place was, without windows and not looking as clean and healthy as there. And that's where we started to make a new life for ourselves. I went to school. First of all, the Red Cross sent me to Switzerland for 3 months, where I lived with a Swiss family who looked after me and were very good to me. That's where I learned to live a proper life for the first time. My mother made herself a job of making dresses. She had a dress on one day when the milkman, in those days, the milkman and the breadman and all that came to your place and delivered the milk and bread. And the milkman said to my mother when she opened the door, "That's a nice dress you're wearing, Mrs. Boas. Where did you get it?" And she said, "Would you like one?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Just give me the size for your wife, and give me the size of your wife, and I'll make you a dress like this." She had bought the material at a department store called the Bergen-Belsen and made a dress for herself. She made a dress for the milkman. The milkman told the baker told the butcher, and that's how my mother made some money making dresses. My father went out at night mainly with a push bike and with a basket in front selling fruit. They ended up taking a spot at the Dutch market, the Hague markets, and had a stand there selling dress material. One of the people in Bergen-Belsen was a Jewish man called, can't think of his name at the moment, who had a fabric factory in Amsterdam, material factory, and he was friendly with my father and my mother, and he gave them the dress material on credit, and they would only have to pay for it when they sold it. And that's how we started making a living. I had a little sister born. This is the list of children going to Switzerland. That's my parents immediately after the war. My mother up here, of course, my father, you can see there, me, a friend, now me, my brother. Now, 1947, a little sister was born. The first joy in my parents' life and my brother's and my life. February 1947. Estelle was her name. These two photos of me and my father are the only photos I ever had of myself and my father. My father, unfortunately, passed away in 1948, August 1948. Stressed hard, couldn't take it anymore. But in the meantime, my parents had decided they were going to immigrate to Australia, where my father found a distant relative, the sister actually of my grandmother, my father's mother. My father died and my mother's postponed going to, he died in 1948. My mother postponed going to Australia till 1954, where my brother, myself, and my little sister, who was now 7 and I was now 14, I had my 40th birthday on the boat going to Australia. And the trip from Rotterdam, I think we left, to Sydney was 7-8 weeks. And I had my birthday on the 40th birthday on the boat. We arrived in Sydney on the 13th of March, 1954. That's me in Holland. Now, the Dutch, stick to Holland for a minute, and the Dutch bureaucracy, the Dutch population were very anti-Semitic after the war, immediately after the war. They didn't like the Jews coming back. There weren't that many came back. I told you before, 5,000. Now, some of the Jews initially had fled overseas, and that's why the figure of 107,000 comes from. And some had sort of gone into hiding in Holland, altogether about 20,000 in total. So that after the war, not many of those when overseas came back, and there were probably about 15,000 Jews in Holland. But my brother got into fights at school when he was called a dirty Jew. He was older than me. When I went to school, I was 6 years old after I'd been to Switzerland. I couldn't add up. I couldn't write. I could hardly read. Nobody ever taught me as a young child how to read or write. Nobody ever read me a bedtime story. And I was terrible at school and always was. Now, the Dutch were not helpful to the Jews at all. They brought in a pension system for Jews in 1973, 74. And it was for Jews who had been in camps. And my mother applied from Australia, my brother applied, and they received a pension. I applied in 1973, but now I was 32 years old. I'd had a job. I was a salesman in Australia selling office equipment like typewriters and made commission. And the Dutch knocked me back for a pension. And to this day, I've never received a pension from the Dutch. I'm fortunate that later on in life, I didn't need that money that they were giving away, or not giving away, that the people who received it had earned the hard way. I made a life for myself, which I'll tell you about in a second, and I didn't need the Dutch anymore. My mother, the Dutch railways paid some compensation in, I think it was about 2018 or 19, and I can't remember how much it was. It wasn't a hell of a lot of money, but I did get that. I think it was $15,000, so about 7,000 euros. That's the only thing I got from the Dutch. I don't want anything from the Dutch. But when my mother passed away in 2001, my mother had a very hard life. She had children that she looked after. My brother got into trouble because of he was affected badly by the war. He had nightmares about it. I'm fortunate. I don't remember anything. I've blocked everything out of my mind. When my mother passed away, I decided to write a book about our family surviving the Holocaust. That put me in touch with Dutch government departments all over Holland. It took me 15 years to write my book because the one thing you can't do when you write a book about the Holocaust is make mistakes. And I haven't. My book is called I'm Not a Victim, I'm a Survivor, which I am. I certainly am not a victim. I worked hard when I came to Australia. I left school at 15, got a job at a radio station as what they call a panel operator, the person who played all the records. I then got a job as a typewriter salesman and then got a job selling cash registers. I sold office equipment, got married, had 2 children, and who are now grown up men in their 50s, and I've now got 4 grandchildren. I got divorced in 1987. I didn't have a penny to my name. When I got divorced, I went to the bank to borrow some money so I could put a deposit on an apartment, and I got refused because I didn't have any money and I wasn't earning enough money. But the Dutch still didn't think I deserved a pension. I did apply and I got knocked back again. I then, this is us arriving on this trip, the Sibayak, arriving in here in Sydney. We lived in a place called Coogee, which was near this beach. We lived here at the bottom, flat. We had no furniture. The first few weeks we slept on the floor. We had no money really. My mother, within a week, had a job as a cleaning lady at the local hotel. That's where I worked, the radio station called 2CH, a typewriter, all of Eddy typewriter sold. This is a business that I also sold Canadian Olympic coins. I did a pretty good job on that. They invited me to Canada to the Olympics, gave me a pass to go everywhere. I sold Olympic coins. Then I met a man called Robert Louis Dreyfus. I joined a company called IMS, which was a pharmaceutical market research company. This is after selling cash registers and things like that. This was a whole new job for me, and I got the job as sales manager with an average salary. And the major shareholder in the company was a man called Robert Louis Dreyfus, a Frenchman. The head office IMS was in London, but it was an American company listed on the Dow Stock Exchange. One day, Robert Louis Dreyfus came to Australia, and I was invited I was the most junior manager there, to a luncheon. Eight people got invited, 7 of them were more senior than me, but so happened that I was put next to Robert Louis Dreyfus at the lunch table. Hardly anybody spoke to him. So I said to him, and I'd heard rumors that he was interested in horse racing, and I've always been interested in horse racing. And I said to him, when are you going back to Europe? And he said, tomorrow. I said, what are you doing tonight? He said, not much, I'll go back to my hotel. I said, would you like to go to the harness racing? He said, I'd love to. And everybody at the table looked at me, and it was silence. So I rang the committee, the president of the committee of the harness racing club, who knew me, asked him, could I get a table in the committee room? He said yes. Took Robert that night to the harness racing, took him back to his hotel. He went home, and that question, what are you doing tonight, changed my life completely. couple of months later, after this happened, after this happened, I got a phone call from Robert saying, this was on a Friday night, can you come to Singapore? I want to talk to you, come over for dinner. So I flew over and he told me, I don't mind if you come first class. Well, I'd hardly ever been in an aeroplane. My first aeroplane trip, I was 23 years old. And when I did fly, I was obviously always economy. But I didn't have that many trips. So I flew over in luxury, had dinner with him. He gave me some personal jobs to do. One of them was to go to Brazil, where we had a company, where IMS had a company, and he wanted me to check that where they were buying a computer there, and he wanted to make sure the purchase was 100% kosher. He was a bit concerned that there might be some backhanders flying around. I went to Brazil, which was also an eye-opener for me. I wrote a report about it, and from then on, he looked after me, I have to say. This Robert Louis Dreyfus changed my life. I went from not being able to borrow money. In the end, when I wanted to buy, he offered me a job in America. I was offered a job, and I accepted the job. I was just divorced, had no money. The bank had just refused me even loan me money for a deposit. I wrote to him, I said, I can't come to America because I don't want to leave here without a home, a roof over my head. So he said, the company will back me, guarantee me with the bank. And that's, from then on, I didn't have to worry about money anymore. He put me in all these pension plans. I was offered shares in the company, and he looked after, but I worked hard for him. I took the job in New York. The company got me an apartment on the corner of 79th Street and First Avenue on the Upper East Side. This is me watching the New York Marathon from my balcony. I lived in New York from 1989 to 1993. I traveled 6 months of the year, mainly for Robert, all different jobs. He then sold the company to Dun and Bradstreet, which I didn't like, and they didn't like me because I had this connection with Robert. Robert ended up buying Adidas. He did offer me a job at Adidas in Australia, but I had to turn that back because I didn't want to work for a German company. But it didn't make any difference, because after my 4 years in America, I was pretty well set up for life. I was in charge of a company called Clark O'Neill, which was a pharmaceutical direct mail business in New Jersey. I spoke at conferences around the world. In 1991, I was invited to Israel to speak at the post office with a friend of mine, Peter van der Busken, a Dutchman. And that was a great trip. I set up a business called an events company, ran seminars, called the main one being the Pan Pacific Direct Marketing Symposium, which ran for 20 years. And I had done a deal with the general manager, who was my direct boss instead of Robert, that for when I came back to Australia, I could buy the events management business for $1. And when I resigned from the company, got paid out all what they owed me, I sold this company as well made good money out of $1. I was invited into the Australian Direct Marketing Hall of Fame. I bought myself a racehorse, which won some big races. I met some famous people, which is a famous trainer. My wife and I, Donna and I got married when I got back from America in 1994, and we still married 33 years later. In 1998, we met Margaret Thatcher at a luncheon. We met the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard. I started to get annoyed with the Dutch government for the way they kept running me around and never, you had to write to them 2 or 3 times before you got an answer. So at the bottom of every letter that I wrote to a Dutch government, I said, all I want is an apology before I die. I wrote to a Dutch prime minister who wrote me back way back in 2009, who wrote me back saying that they could have done better and should have done better. Now, I'll tell you a quick story because I don't have a lot of time, but that's the end of my story. And after I finished my book, I rang a lady and wanted to give her a copy of my book, and she she was going to London, and I was going to go to London to speak about my book, and met her in London. She invited me to the ballet, and I had said to her about wanting an apology from, in my correspondence with her, I said my aim is now to get the apology from the Dutch government. She said, I'll meet you at the Opera House in London. We met in London. She had a friend with her. She talked to the friend and said to the friend, Eddy wants an apology from the Dutch government. Can you help him? And I thought this was very strange. She was sitting next to her friend. I was sitting next to her. And this man said to me, why? And I told him that the Dutch were the only Western European country had never apologized to the Jews that they sent to concentration camps. He said, write a letter to the Prime Minister of Holland, Mark Rutte, and I will hand deliver it to him. And the lady said to me, he is a personal friend of Mark Rutte. I wrote a letter to Mark Rutte, and this is his reply. He said, recently your letter was passed on to me by Mr. So-and-so and so-and-so. And the basic gist of the letter is, we could have and should have done better. Now, I never heard from Mark Rutte again. On 26th of January 1980, I turned 80. And I had a birthday party on a cruiser. That's me and my mother. We went on a Sydney Harbour cruise. And what happened was, on 26th of January 1980, the Dutch Prime Minister apologized, a damn swear, to Dutch Jews. The time was 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 26th of January, which was my 80th birthday, and I was on a cruise at 10 o'clock that same night. The next morning, I found out that the Dutch Prime Minister had actually apologized. Now, I've been told that my letter helped. That's my story. I've done my time. I'll go through this quickly. This is my mother and myself, my mother and my sister. This is the only photo I have of my brother, my sister, and myself. My eldest son and family, my youngest son and family, my wife and I. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for listening to me. I think I'm only 3 minutes over time. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And if anybody has any questions, we can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to just take your screen down for questions.
Okay.
Okay, I can do that for you. Okay.
Need to get rid of this.
All right.
Okay, sorry.
You. We have a couple of questions. One is, did your father contract typhus while working in the camp?
No, he did not. No, he got sick afterwards when we had left on the train. But he died he died of stress, and his heart just failed one night, just like that.
Thank you. Why were you sent to Switzerland?
What was the question? Why did I go to Switzerland?
Yes.
The Red Cross sent Dutch Jewish children after the war to Switzerland to live with families in Switzerland for about 3 months. I was sent there, and my brother was sent there. He went to a different family. He couldn't settle down there. I enjoyed it very much because it's the first time that I got, uh, to see how real people lived who had money. Because my parents in Holland, in the first year, certainly had nothing. And I saw these people who were very, very, very nice to me over the years. They passed away, and I kept in touch with them.
Thank you. Did you feel that the Prime Minister's personal letter was sufficient as an apology?
As an apology, no. It was just a letter which the previous Prime Minister, and I can't think of his name at the moment, had uh, sent to me, which basically said uh, we could have and should have done better.
What happened to your brother in his adult life?
My brother had a terrible life. He was affected by the war badly. He had nightmares, and I didn't appreciate that for a long time. I was growing up a teenager. I was leading my life. My brother couldn't handle Australia, and when he was 25, he returned to Holland to live, got married, and had 2 children. He just could not handle living a normal life. When you're a child like that, 8, 9, and I did not appreciate that till later in my life. Uh, and you get told you got to steal uh, clothing, you got to steal food. Uh, you know, your upbringing is to learn how to steal. And he got into trouble with the police about things like that. Nothing serious. I started to appreciate when I lived in New York. I was also responsible for Holland, one of the companies in Holland that we owned, the IMS owned. And I used to go to Holland at least once a month. And I had lunch or dinner with my brother and his wife. All he talked about, this is in the 1990s, early 1990s, was the war, the Holocaust, over lunch or over dinner. And that's when I started to realize that he was badly affected. He died in December 2017. When I found out, I flew over to Holland for the funeral, and the doctor at the funeral told me he had a nightmare the night he died. So that's how he was affected by it. And there are people like that. Well, I won't say fortunate. Well, I am fortunate that I don't give the Holocaust a thought, except when I speak about it like I did now. Uh, I, I certainly have blocked it out of my mind. I don't talk about it otherwise.
Thank you. You mentioned that you went to Holland frequently. Did you go to Europe a lot? And what was it like for you to go to Europe in your adult life?
Well, the first time I went back to Europe was on a holiday with when I started to make some money and earn good commission. I blew it all on going on a holiday to Holland. This had to be on memory 1980, 1981. After that, I went to Holland only after I got the job. Then it was a different life for me because, I'm not bragging now, but I was allowed through Robert Louis Dreyfus, gave me allows me to fly first class or even the Concorde if I had to go somewhere urgently. So I started to live a totally different life where money, although it wasn't my personal money, it was the company's money, uh, wasn't really a problem. So I arrived then in Holland and stayed in the best hotels in Amsterdam or The Hague. And where I did actually, I didn't mention it, I did go to Europe in 1963 actually. I'd made some money selling typewriters, and three of us typewriter salesmen took a boat to Europe to hitchhike through Europe. I forgot about telling you about that. I'll quickly tell you. I, I took a boat, I arrived in Amsterdam. I stayed with that one cousin of my father. And then I hitchhiked to Denmark at the border of Holland and Germany, where I got dropped off. I walked around for about half an hour with a rucksack on my back. Will I one day go into Germany? It took me quite a bit, but then I bit the bullet and hitchhiked through Germany to Denmark and went to Copenhagen. And then I hitched all the way back through Germany, through Belgium and France, and all over Spain. I was hitchhiking in Europe for over 6 months. I ended up in Israel, not planned. I met someone in Athens in the youth hostel. I had no money. I lived on what they called $5 a day in those days. And you earn money by picking fruit or things like that, or selling blood. And at selling blood in Thessalonica in Greece, I met a Rhodesian guy who was going to go to Israel to work on a kibbutz. He wasn't Jewish. I went with him. We bought a £10 English pound ticket that allowed us not inside anywhere in the boat, but had to stay on the deck for 2 nights. And went to Israel, worked on a kibbutz for 3 months, made my way back to Australia, and went back into having a job there. So that was my traveling to Europe. I don't care much for Europe. I think people ask me, do I hate the Dutch for what they've done to me? My answer, and they also ask me, do I hate the Germans? I don't hate anybody. I might not like somebody, but certainly hate I don't think anybody should hate anyone. And the Dutch, I think they're terrific people. I follow all the Dutch soccer that goes on. I follow the Dutch sportsmen. The only time I don't barrack for the Dutch is when they play Australia. I barrack for Australia, but otherwise, if the Dutch play anybody, I follow the soccer here. Nowadays, you can watch everything. Germans, I've been to Germany because one of my bosses at IMS was a German, and I had to go and see him. So that took me a little while to accept that. But again, if I knocked it back, I might have lost my job. So I wasn't going to let the Germans affect my life as I was giving it then.
Thank you so much. Did you ever talk about these memories with your mother or with your brother? When you mentioned your brother spoke about it, did you ever talk to him or to your mother about it?
Yes, when my brother, I did. My mother did the Spielberg interview where, they sent people around the world to interview Holocaust survivors. And my mother would only do if I sat next to her. So I was there all day when she was being recorded. And that's the first time that I learned what actually had happened to us. She never spoke about it before. She asked me, should she do this interview? And I said yes, because the Holocaust, as I say on my slide here, must never be forgotten. So I sat next to her. She answered, took all day to interview her. She was 88 or something by then. She died a couple of years later, 85, I think, yeah. And that's how I learned a lot. And then started to do research. And when I started writing my book, I did get a lot of information from my brother. I learned to check everything, not once, but 2 or 3 times. What I found, I could ask a question to a Dutch government department about something, ask the same question to the Germans, ask the same question to the American Museum, the Holocaust Museum, which had a reputation of having all the records, and I get 3 different answers. So then you have to sort out which is the right answer. And that took a lot of time. As I said, it took me 15 years. And I did take a break of a couple of years because it became too much. But I did finish the book, and we are going to release an educational video on the 15th of October. That took a year to make, of my story of survival, because I believe all survivors should put their records on either video or both, or a book. Not everybody can write a book, but certainly every survivor still alive should make a video. And mine is a 47-minute video, which hopefully will be used in schools for education.
Thank you. Did your mother ever remarry?
She did. Unfortunately, she was in her late 70s. She met a Jewish man at a Jewish female luncheon. Females invited people and all this. She married him, but unfortunately, he died about 4 or 5 years later. The good thing about it was she had a permanent roof over her head after she married him. He was a widow with no children, and he left his home to my mother, so she didn't have to rent anymore. That was the good thing that yeah. He was a very nice man.
Thank you. Did your boss, later on when you mentioned you were going to the horse race, did your boss know that you were a Holocaust survivor?
Yes, he did. I didn't talk about it, but somebody had told him after the luncheon. I found that out later. He and I got really friendly. I mean, when he came here for the Swiss, he owned Adidas, and my son went to work for Adidas in Germany for 2 or 3 years, or maybe even more than that. And when he came to the Sydney Olympics in 2000, we had dinner together, but he passed away in 2009, which was a pity. I'm in touch with his widow every once in a while.
Thank you. And if you could just elaborate the job you mentioned that your father had that was that really damaged him.
Well, his job, the good part about it was he had to look after horses, and the Germans fed horses better than they did the Jews. The Jews never got an apple. The Jews never got a carrot. The best they got was a bit of bread and a bit of potato, and a turnip soup, which was really dark-colored water. So the job was to go around the camp and pick up the dead bodies. And when the Germans stopped feeding the prisoners around about, as I said before, November 44, and it got worse, lots of people died. When the British went in, they found 10,000 bodies lying around, because we had been put on a train a week before the British entered Bergen-Belsen. We went on the train on the 9th, and the British entered on the 15th. So there were a lot of bodies lying around. And that's what was Father's job. And he had to go take the bodies into a hut first, but that filled up quickly. So then he had to just put it into open graves. And in the mornings, he had to go past all the barracks and to see and collect the bodies. So it was a terrible job. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But it saved our life.
One question is, how do you stay so healthy and sharp today?
Thank you for whoever asked that question. And when I worked, it was hard to look after myself. But in 2002, I had a triple heart bypass. I just more or less retired from working. And that woke me up. I was overweight. My heart gave in. I had a triple bypass. And what happened was, I'm not a good patient. And my wife, Donna, said to me, and I had to, after the bypass, I had to stay home for 8 weeks. And she said, you're a terrible patient. You're annoying me. And why don't you go sit in front of your computer and write a book about your life? You've had an interesting life. So I did because I could type selling typewriters, and she was only joking since she said all that. And I started writing my book, and I started exercising. I walked every morning after the heart bypass when I was able to walk again. I did that till just recently when I stopped walking, which was only basically last year. And I watch what I eat. So, and I still play golf twice a week on bad golf, but I still play it on a Wednesday and a Saturday. So I keep myself active. I also tell all my friends who grow old with me, the one thing you got to do, which I've done all my life, is keep my brain going. Writing the books, I think, kept me young looking. I think because I got to use my brain all the time, I got to do research on it. I was told by a Holocaust scholar when I started writing my book, the one thing you cannot do is make a mistake in names or dates in your book, because the Holocaust deniers will hit it, and use it. So whenever I got a date from the Dutch, I made sure I double checked that with the Germans and the Israelis and the Americans. So in my book, and the Dutch government has never, I'm very critical of the Dutch in my book. I'm very critical in my video of the Dutch, and deservedly so.
Thank you. And we just have two comments. One of our viewers says she's from Australia as well, from the Central Coast, NSW, and says, my mother was a Holocaust survivor, originally from Vienna, then The Hague, and then the Dutch East Indies, where she was in a Japanese POW camp. She and her parents arrived in Fremantle, Washington. Sorry, not Washington, WA, in 1946. And another comment says, survivor does not really encompass who you are. There is so much that you have contributed to Jews and to humanity as a witness. You were an amazing example of a human being who has stayed human despite horrible adversity. I want to thank you so much for being with us this morning and for being here so early in the morning so that we can tune in the United States. But again, you had people from all over the world, people from Australia and Germany listening to you. And I want to thank everyone so much for being here today and for listening. And again, we appreciate everything you do for the world by sharing your story and your message.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I much appreciate it. I much appreciate people coming to watch and listen to this Zoom from wherever you are. Take care with yourself. It's a dangerous world today. Keep yourself safe, everybody. And thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. Anytime I'm available, anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Thank
Goodbye.
you. And we hope to see everyone next Sunday.